Welcome back to our channel, folks. Today we have some fascinating data to discuss the inflation rates in Jamaica over several decades. Inflation is a crucial economic indicator that affects everyone's daily lives. We've compiled data from March 1963 to March 2023, and what's interesting is that it's intertwined with the political landscape of Jamaica. So let's dive into this intriguing story of inflation and politics. Charts are based on data obtained from the Bank of Jamaica website. Before going any further, let us define inflation. Inflation in its simplest terms refers to the rate of increase in prices of goods and services over a given period of time, such as a 6-month period or a year. Also, please bear in mind that information for each year quoted relates to March, what is understood to be the end of the government's financial or fiscal year. Kindly take note of the following. The green and orange bars represent the governing parties, JLP and PNP, respectively. In the 1960s, Jamaica was mainly governed by the Jamaica Labour Party, JLP. And you can see that inflation rates were relatively low. JLP seemed to have a handle on inflation during that time, with rates rarely exceeding 3%. 1963 to 1971, years of JLP management of the Jamaican economy. Inflation rates. In 1963, the inflation rate was 0.5%, indicating mild deflation, where the general price level decreased slightly. Deflation can be associated with economic challenges, such as reduced consumer spending or economic recession. In 1964, inflation increased to 2.6%, marking a return to positive inflation. This rate is relatively low and suggests economic stability. In 1965, inflation remained low at 1.3%, indicating continued economic stability. In 1966, inflation increased to 3.0%, still at a moderate level. In 1967, inflation decreased to 0.07%, showing that the economy remained relatively stable. In 1968, there was a notable increase in inflation to 7.3%, suggesting some economic changes or challenges. In 1969, inflation decreased to 2.9%, which is a positive sign for economic stability. While in 1970, there was a significant increase in inflation to 14.5%, possibly related to economic policies or external factors. In 1971, inflation remained elevated at 4.6%. But as we moved into the early 1970s, a significant shift happened. The People's National Party, PNP, took over, and inflation rates began to rise dramatically. It peaked in 1974 at a whopping 26.3%. 1976 was a standout year because the inflation rate dropped to 56.7%. Yes, that's negative inflation. It's crucial to remember that this was during a period of PNP governance. It's a clear indicator that special circumstances were at play. There was a geopolitical context operating at this time: Western powers versus the Union of the Soviet Socialist Republic, USSR. The era of the Cold War, the ideological battle between communism and capitalism. 1972 to 1979, years of PNP management of the Jamaican economy. Inflation rates. 1. In 1972, the inflation rate was 4.1%, which is relatively moderate and suggests economic stability. 2. In 1973, inflation increased significantly to 11.1%, indicating a rise in the general price level. 2. Such an increase could be due to various factors, including changes in global economic conditions and domestic policies. 3. In 1974, inflation spiked to 26.3%, indicating a period of high inflation. 3. This is a significant concern, as high and sustained inflation can have detrimental effects on an economy, such as eroding purchasing power. 4. In 1975, inflation remained elevated at 16.4%. 5. In 1976, there was a remarkable drop in inflation to 56.7%, which suggests a period of deflation where the general price level decreased. 5. Such a drop could be related to specific economic conditions or policies, and it's quite unusual. 6. In 1977, inflation increased to 8.28%, indicating a return to positive inflation. 7. In 1978, inflation remained high at 16.5%. 8. In 1979, there was a significant increase in inflation to 46.4%, marking another period of very high inflation. In the 1980s, the JLP returned to power and inflation was relatively tamed once again. But by 1984, it started climbing. 1980 to 1989, years of JLP management of the Jamaican economy. Inflation rates, 1. In 1981, the inflation rate was 18.2%, indicating relatively high inflation. This suggests that the economy faced challenges that led to rising prices. 2. In 1982, inflation decreased to 6.2%, marking a significant drop and indicating a possible attempt to control inflation through economic policies. 3. In 1983, inflation increased slightly to 7.1%, which, while still relatively moderate, may have reflected economic challenges or policy adjustments. 4. In 1984, inflation surged to 20.3%, indicating a period of high inflation. Such an increase could be related to various factors, such as changes in global economic conditions, domestic policies, or supply and demand dynamics. 5. In 1985, inflation remained elevated at 27.2%, signifying a continuation of the high inflation period. 6. In 1986, inflation decreased to 17.2%, still relatively high. 7. In 1987, inflation decreased further to 6.3%, indicating that the government may have implemented policies to combat high inflation. 8. In 1988, inflation increased to 7.6%, suggesting ongoing economic challenges. In February of 1989, PNP regained control and the inflation rates shot up. The early 1990s were marked by hyperinflation, with rates reaching 96.6% in 1992. This was a critical period for Jamaica's economy. In the 1990s and early 2000s, inflation rates remained relatively high under the PNP. 1989 to 2007, years of PNP management of the Jamaican economy. Inflation rates, 1. In 1989, the inflation rate was 11.3%, indicating moderate inflation. 2. In 1990, inflation increased to 19.3%, which is relatively high. 3. In 1991, inflation further increased to 26.2%, indicating ongoing inflationary pressures. 4. In 1992, inflation surged to a significantly high 96.6%, marking a period of hyperinflation. 5. In 1993, inflation remained relatively high at 14.5%. 6. In 1994, inflation increased to 35.26%, signifying a continuation of high inflation. 7. In 1995, inflation remained elevated at 19.0%. 8. In 1996, inflation increased to 29.4%, continuing a period of high inflation. 9. In 1997, inflation decreased to 8.1%. 10. In 1998, inflation remained stable at 8.1%. 11. In 1999, inflation decreased to 5.6%. 12. In 2000, inflation increased to 8.6%. 13. In 2001, inflation decreased slightly to 5.2%. 14. In 2002, inflation increased to 7.0%. 15. In 2003, inflation remained relatively stable at 5.5%. 16. In 2004, inflation increased to 14.8%. 17. In 2005, inflation was 12.7%. 18. In 2006, inflation was 9.2%. 19. In 2007, inflation was 6.8%. In September of 2007, the JLP came back into power, and in 2008, the global financial crisis significantly impacted the economy, leading to a high inflation rate of 19.04%. 2008 to 2011, years of JLP management of the Jamaican economy. Inflation rates. 1. In 2008, the inflation rate was 19.4%, which is relatively high. This is largely attributed to the global financial crisis that occurred in that year, affecting economies worldwide. Jamaica was no exception, and the crisis led to increased inflation due to economic instability and decreased consumer confidence. 2. In 2009, the inflation rate decreased to 10.7%. 2. The decline was likely a result of government and central bank measures to stabilize the economy after the financial crisis. 3. In 2010, inflation increased slightly to 12.9%. 3. While still relatively high, it indicates that the country was grappling with economic challenges even after the crisis. 4. In 2011, inflation dropped to 6.04%, showing signs of economic recovery and stability. 4. The decreasing trend in inflation suggests that the government's efforts to manage the economy were having an impact. 2012 to 2015, years of PNP management of the Jamaican economy. Inflation rates. 1. In 2012, the inflation rate was 6.8%. This rate is relatively moderate and indicates that the economy was relatively stable at that time. 2. In 2013, inflation increased to 8.27%. 3. This uptick could be due to various factors, including changes in global economic conditions, changes in domestic policies, or fluctuations in commodity prices. 4. In 2014, inflation remained elevated at 7.9%. 5. This suggests that the PNP government continued to face challenges in controlling inflation. 4. In 2015, inflation decreased to 4.3%, showing signs of stabilization and possibly more effective economic policies. 2016 to 2023, years of JLP management of the Jamaican economy. Inflation rates. 1. In 2016, the inflation rate was 2.8%, indicating relatively low and stable inflation during the early years of JLP's governance. 2. In 2017, inflation increased to 4.5%, which is still within a moderate range. The slight increase might be due to various factors, including changes in global economic conditions or domestic policies. 3. In 2018, inflation remained relatively stable at 3.6%. 4. In 2019, inflation increased slightly to 3.8%. 5. In 2020, inflation rose to 4.7%, possibly due to the economic impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, which had global consequences. 6. In 2021, inflation remained elevated at 4.4%, suggesting that the pandemic's effects continued to influence the economy. 7. In 2022, there was a notable increase in inflation to 11.9%. This could be a result of various factors, including pandemic-related disruptions and government policies. 8. In 2023, inflation decreased to 6.3%, showing some signs of stabilization. In summary, some points to highlight. Inflation trends. 1. Inflation rates have fluctuated significantly over the years, reflecting periods of high and low inflation. 2. There are clear shifts in inflation patterns between JLP and PNP governments. Party influence on inflation. 1. JLP, Jamaica Labour Party, initially had relatively low inflation rates in the 1960s, followed by a spike in 1970. 2. PNP, People's National Party, took over in 1972 and faced high inflation rates throughout the 1970s. The highest inflation was recorded in 1974 at 26.3%. 3. In 1976, there was a notable drop in inflation during the PNP government, but it was likely influenced by specific economic policies. 4. The 1980s saw JLP returning with lower inflation rates, but it started to rise again in 1984. 5. PNP returned to power in 1989 with relatively high inflation, which peaked in 1992 at 96.6%. This period of hyperinflation was a significant concern. 6. In the 1990s, PNP still managed a high inflation rate, although it decreased in the late 1990s. 7. In the early 2000s, inflation remained high under PNP, with rates often above 5%. 8. In 2008, JLP took over again with an inflation rate of 19.4% due to the global financial crisis. Inflation stayed relatively high for the next few years. 9. The recent trend has seen a return to lower inflation rates under JLP. Economic context. 1. Economic factors, global events, and government policies play a significant role in driving inflation rates. For example, the global financial crisis in 2008 had an impact on Jamaica's economy. Election years. 1. There is a noticeable pattern of inflation rates peaking in the years of elections. This could be due to election-related spending and economic policies aimed at appeasing voters. Long-term implications. 1. High and sustained inflation, as seen in the 1970s and early 1990s, can have detrimental effects on an economy, eroding purchasing power, and increasing economic instability. Recent trends. 1. In recent years, inflation has been relatively moderate and under control under the JLP government. It's essential to note that while there appears to be a correlation between the governing party and inflation trends, many other factors, including global economic conditions, monetary policy, and fiscal policy, influence inflation rates. Therefore, it's not solely the responsibility of the governing party. Nonetheless, this data provides insights into the economic history and the relationship between inflation and political leadership in Jamaica.